Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the Friday show. I see you in there, Mary. I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you made it. Um, so in the last live stream I did, I discussed what I see occurring in 2023. And insofar as that was concerned, I discussed that I believe personally that certain things are going to happen in 2023. Like I see this proxy conflict being brought to a swift conclusion over there in Eastern Europe, which I also see leading to the collapse, the demise of NATO as well as the EU. I see the EU falling apart. And I also see, of course, and I've talked about this for many, many, many months, I see a large scale collapse for our country here. I see the collapse of the USA, a complete like USSR style collapse that will lead into a multi-factional Syrian style situation. And that is as biblically correct as a point of view as it is logically correct, because when you look into Jeremiah, it specifically addresses a multi-factional, multi-way civil conflict. Various leaders, it says conflict or violence will erupt between various leaders. Of course, depending on the translation you read, and that's before we even get invaded. So what I see for 2023 is very much that. I see the multi-faction civil conflict breaking out after a large-scale USSR-style collapse, and that would involve a complete currency collapse. So it'd be financial, it would be economic, because remember, a lot of the economy is underpinned by usury and debt. They actually count credit transactions as part of a nation's GDP, which is really crazy because, all that is debt. It's just debt. It's usury. It's debt. It's not real. It's fake. So I've already discussed before, and I've kept track of this for a very, very long time. I've diligently kept track of this. 2 years ago, had reported when the economy had shrunk officially by their own numbers, by the central bank's own numbers, the economy had shrunk by a third because of what occurred back in that year of 2020. You saw the economy contracting by about a third. A third of the GDP was gone, and a third of the economy with it, because of all the shutdowns and everything, and the impact that it had on the economy at large. It really devastated the economy. And I had evidently correctly predicted that by now it has shrunk by half, which it has. And I've also gone over those numbers before, I think a few live streams ago when I discussed the statistics I had run to. I think it was on like AEI.org or something like that, where the central bank reported that the economy was now halfway basically in the dumps. It had shrunk. So it's basically at that point to where we are halfway in the toilet insofar as the economy goes. Sorry about that. I had to shut off the ringtone and everything. I guess somebody was trying to text me. But yeah, it has shrunk, and now it's $12 trillion gone. So all in all, that is going to lead to a total collapse, because you can't have an economy that is basically that far contracted and it managed to somehow survive. There's also the situation developing with the petro yuan renminbi, which is going to be a real thing. The BRICS plus nations, the OPEC nations are all coming into alignment with China fully and completely. I made a community posting yesterday where I was going to discuss these issues, because I've already discussed them many, many months ago. And yes, I don't normally watch that channel that I had shared, but you know what? Everything that that man said in that channel is correct. And many months ago, I'd already discussed that China has hoarded 70% of the world's corn, 60% of the world's rice, 50% of the world's wheat, 450 million heads of pork, which is 50% of the entire world's supply of pork. They also, of course, have 50,000 egg-laying hens, which lay billions of eggs per day. And of course, they have 5.6 million metric tons of beef, which is the fourth biggest beef supply producer in the world. And they also import an additional 800,000 tons of beef. So they, as well as their, with their food supply, they, as well as that, are basically importing 800,000 barrels per day from Russia, both from their seaborne routes with their tankers, but also from pipelines that have been built between China and Russia. So they are stockpiling for something, and it's going to be something in the future. And we all know what's coming in the future. You see, this stuff is a huge deal, and many people overlook it because people are so worried about, what these Western elites are doing, but they don't even see, they're watching the left hand while the right hand, these Eastern elites, are basically formulating their own plans. I feel like I'm one of the few people that actually points these things out and actually talks about them in great depth because it is very important. Because these things will end up affecting people's lives more than they even know or realize, or even will ever understand. Because, the plans that these elites have for the world are drastically different from the plans that the Western elites have. You see, some people think, and this is where I disagree, but some people think that there's going to be some sort of like Aldous Huxley peaceful transition into this NWO system. But I have to disagree because the Bible, is very different. They have a very different definition of what's coming in the future. In fact, the future is not going to be a Jetsons future. The future is going to be a Flintstones future, because the world will be ravaged and devastated by collapses of supply chains, food supplies, economies, currencies. And it'll also be totally ravaged by conflicts, by wars. The Bible says rumors of wars, but also wars, the actual wars themselves. There will be wars and rumors of wars. So you're going to have a world that'll be embroiled in conflict, and then the mother of all wars is going to occur, and that will be World War III. That'll be your conflict that pits East against West, where the West, woefully ill-prepared for a massive scale conflict, will be overrun by the forces of the East, by China, by Russia, and by all their smaller little allies like North Korea, Belarus, Serbia, Iran, Pakistan, and whoever else jumps in the ring, Cuba and Nicaragua, Venezuela, all these little countries that are going to jump on the BRICS Plus bandwagon because it's going to be the Western Economic Forum and their underlings versus the BRICS Plus and their underlings. And you're already seeing the polarization occurring right now before your very eyes. These have been plans that have been long in the works by both the elites of the CCP regime in China, but also the Western elites, the elites in Russia, all over the world. There's different elites competing for power of who is going to rule this one world system. And the one world system is going to be birthed out of a third and final world war. So there can only be one. There can only be one winner, because evil only cooperates with other evil insofar as it benefits themselves. They don't care about each other. They never have, and they never will. Even the one world regime that Revelation discusses, ruled by these 10 Eastern kings, these 10 Eastern victorious kings in World War III, even that doesn't last for very long. And why would that be? Because evil always lusts for more and more power, more and more wealth, more and more control, more of everything. It's never satiated, it's never satisfied. So there's going to be infighting developing because remember, it does say that the 10 kings who give their power unto the beast, they'll reign with him for 1 hour. And 1 hour in biblical timing is not very long, folks. It's not. So we're talking months, So before that, it's going to devolve into a lot of infighting and a lot of chaos. And of course, the wrath of God is going to come down at some point too. So, you're going to have a very chaotic environment. There's not going to be any sort of peaceful transition into a one world system. It's not going to happen like that. It rationally and logically, it can't happen like that, but also biblically, it can't happen like that. Man is a very destructive creature, and you're going to see a level of pandemonium that you could never even imagine. It's going to be really horrible. It's going to be nasty. So let me see what everybody's saying here before I continue. See who all came in. There's Ron Johnson, howdy, and Mary, C-Mac, good to see you. Everybody, welcome. So, for the thumbnail, I have a squadron of JH-7 Chinese ground attack aircraft dropping munitions, basically. That's what the thumbnail is, and that's a pretty appropriate thumbnail for the conversation tonight because all the work that's been done on this channel has been done to highlight the Third World War, Fall of Mystery Babylon, USA, and that has as much to do with the invasion work I've done as the actual civil conflict documentary I also made, the Second American Syrian-style civil conflict with multiple different factions all having it out with one another. Fighting over control of a collapsed and ruined nation. Now, they're on different timelines, but what I mean by that is that the civil conflict docu-series happens on the correct biblical timeline where we do have a collapse and a civil conflict according to Jeremiah. But then I made the invasion work as its own separate timeline, even though that still happens at the end of my civil conflict. It talks about then we get invaded at the very end of the last video in that 5-video series. It talks about we get invaded at the very end of that. But when I did all my invasion work, that's all on the same timeline of its own timeline where they come in hot. Like right now, they don't wait for us to have a collapse and an internal conflict, which, according to the word, it doesn't happen like that. And, due to the austerity and frugality and just general cheapness of the Eastern, leaders, they're not going to do it like that. They're not going to waste a whole bunch of resources because they already know what's going to happen. They know we're going to collapse. They know we're going to fall apart. And what better than to have your enemy rip themselves apart to make your job of occupation and colonization just that much easier? They don't want to come in here and have to occupy this vast of a land and have to fight a giant counterinsurgency campaign. They'd rather us do the heavy lifting for them and wipe each other out. All our best experienced people, like your, combat veterans from the prior wars and such, they'd rather, people that would have been a threat to their occupation, they'd rather them just wipe each other out instead of them having to pile in all these resources, all this money, lives, equipment, everything else. You're not going to waste resources if you know you don't have to, and they know they don't have to. Now, the Chinese and Russian leaders just recently met, so I can only imagine what was discussed in that conversation, but we know that they're doing their own planning, and their own planning revolves around their shared economic, financial, and military interests. So that much is apparent, but we can only imagine what type of deeper depths those conversations have gone to. Now, as far as it relates to the proxy conflict, Russia basically has that entire thing in the bag. They're going to come out victorious and they're winning. They've been winning and they've just been more methodical. They've been more, they've paced themselves when it comes to how they've prosecuted that conflict. And people in the West have mistaken that for it being some kind of weakness. But how is it a weakness if all you did was a limited incursion whereby you only sent in 70 combat battalions, which is only 63 to 65,000 men, to help 30,000 additional militia type forces that were armed and equipped by Russia? I'm talking about the LPR and DPR. That is what has been going on for many months until Russia started this massive buildup for a full-scale invasion. Now, like I discussed in the last live stream and in others, I mentioned that Russia went in with like the kid gloves on. They didn't go bare knuckle. They went in with like the kid gloves, because they see that country as a brother people. They don't necessarily want to brutalize them, but as they've discovered, they're really not left with any other type of choice. I mean, they sort of have to do that at this point, just to bring this thing to an end, because they don't want to give them time to, get integrated fully with the West. They don't want to give time for any sort of mishaps by any sort of unhinged elements that might be stupid enough to pull some type of massive FF event involving certain WMDs. They don't want to allow for that to occur. So they're going to bring this thing to a fairly swift conclusion. And it would only make sense that they would do it before the end of winter instead of waiting through the spring and waiting until summer when the conditions are dry enough on the ground instead of all this mud from all the melted snow, or waiting all the way until fall when the Rasputitsa comes in and makes everything muddy and nasty again. The best times in Eastern Europe to wage any sort of ground campaigns are in the winter or in the summer. They don't want to have to trudge through all this mud and muck, that it would be too much. So I see them bringing this entire thing to its final conclusion with these massive invasion forces they've built up, these 540 plus thousand additional troops added to the 60 something thousand troops they've had since the beginning that are in the east there, which that's going to be the grand pinning maneuver. What's going on in the east, it's going to draw in the proxy country's forces. Now, there's a lot of murmurings about Poland, but we already knew the Poles were there. We've known that they've been there the entire time, because that was many months ago that they started to send in mercenaries. Whether that was personnel that just got out of their military and took contracts for PMCs, or whether it was their actual military units, but they were fighting under the flag of the proxy country. Either way, that's really not a new development, and nor is it really substantial, because, we're talking about a country that doesn't really have that massive of an armed forces anyway, and they have a far less equipment than even the proxy country had when the whole thing started. We're talking about Poland here. They have far fewer armored vehicles than the proxy nation had at the beginning of the conflict. They also, have quite a small air force compared to what the proxy country even had at the beginning, and they've lost all of that. So now the West, continuing to feed in everything that they can possibly give, is having to strip their own units of vital anti-tank systems, man-portable air defense systems, radar systems, artillery howitzer shells, and the systems that fire them. It's getting to be too much, to where they've been having to recently go around the world pilfering for weapons from countries in North Africa and in the Middle East, which is crazy. And now you have even Greece, of all countries, being willing to break an agreement with Russia whereby they're going to give them the S-300 systems that had been given to Greece, well, not given, but sold to Greece with the intention of Greece keeping them for themselves and only for themselves. And, they're breaking that agreement with Russia in order to send those systems to the proxy war. And in replacement for that, they're supposed to be compensated with Patriot systems, which aren't even quite as good as the systems that they're actually giving away to the proxy conflict. It's really ludicrous and stupid, but that's what's going on. A lot of these easternmost NATO nations are basically stripping their militaries to give equipment to this conflict, whereby the westernmost NATO nations are replacing those items with their own items. So, all in all, in the very end, we're still stripping ourselves of equipment, whether we've given stuff directly into the conflict or whether we've given stuff to the European nations that themselves have given away the equipment. So the buck basically stops with us. Whatever is being given either comes directly from us or it comes out of us to replace other items that have been given by other NATO nations. So we're being depleted of our ability when we already had a small ability to wage any type of high intensity conflict. We had a very small ability. Our abilities basically ranged from either counterinsurgency conflicts to a very short-lasting, high-paced, high-intensity conflict, meaning that, yes, okay, if we were to fight a high-intensity conflict as a single bloc, the NATO bloc, we had limitations. By limitations, that had as much to do with the amount of systems we had as the ammo we had for those systems. We were especially lacking in artillery, howitzer, shells. And the NATO nations really don't have that much artillery to begin with as far as the systems. And in the NATO drills, we already know that Britain and France exhaust their entire national stockpile of howitzer shells in only 8 days. That's what those NATO drills revealed. And the Germans, of course, who hardly maintain their military like they should, because, in order to have an effective military, you have to maintain it. You can't not do repairs. You cannot order spare parts and expect your military to function properly. I mean, the Germans are notorious for letting their military go to absolute shambles, and the Italians, British, and French aren't much better. They are better, but they're not much better. And those 4 biggest NATO European contributors don't even have that much hardware to begin with, nor the ammo for it. So NATO as a whole is really not in any position to wage any type of substantial conventional conflict, at least one that's not longer lasting than maybe a few weeks. Because at the rate the Russians have expended ammunition, it seems as if they have an unlimited supply, which, a billion artillery shells of different types. Well, it's damn near limitless because while they're using those shells, they're still producing shells to replace some of those losses. And they have such massive stocks that they could literally fire shells between 20 to 50,000 a day, every day, and not even exhaust their entire stockpile until nearly 40 years has elapsed. So we're going to say between 37 to 40 years is how long it would take them at the rate they're expending shells to run out of shells. So, and China, who has even more than Russia, it would take them even longer. And their production rates are insane. China now has the biggest military industrial complex on the face of the earth, and they have had the biggest for the past 5 years now. So, and that's because all those factories that they had started building at the end of the 90s really started to come online within the past 10 years and, 10 to 5 years. So 5 years ago, their production rate has basically dwarfed every other single solitary nation, including Russia, which before they became the biggest military industrial complex on earth, they were the close runner-up to Russia. meaning they were the close second, and then they reached about parity with them by about 2016, and then 2017 is when you really started to see this ginormous Chi-Com manufacturing come online, to where all these enormous factory complexes that they've been building for years all came online. Now, these aren't small factories. These are massive factories that are either at the very smallest, about the size of the one tank factory we have in Lima, Ohio, or at the largest, they're several times as big as that type of a factory complex is. They're massive. They're constantly cranking out arms and ammunition and vehicles. They're just ginormous. So when it comes to the West versus the East, the West has neither the industrial capacity that the Eastern nations possess, predominantly China, but also even Russia. The West just doesn't have anything that compares to it. All that World War II and Cold War manufacturing capacity industries that we had are all long gone now. We really cannot produce or sustain a production rate of anything that we once could, like back in World War II and, the early Cold War, early to mid Cold War, because by the time of the late 70s, you really started to see a lot of different factories shuttering, and it got even worse as time went on. And then when the Cold War ended in the early 90s, you saw an atmosphere of a sort of like relaxed, sort of like ho-hum type of atmosphere develop, where, we felt that we won this great victory of the Cold War. We don't have to sustain this arms race anymore. We can sort of just shut down most of our stuff and it won't matter. Well, that ended up being a bad mistake, because China and Russia, both who have always viewed us as their real enemy, never stopped producing. They just kept right on. They just kept producing and producing and producing. And China, to the extent to where they've added all these additional factory complexes, they have over 500 ginormous arms manufacturing complexes. Norinco alone, one subsidiary, has 300 massive arms production complexes. And then you have the China South Industries Group with another 200. And then you have their aviation corporation that has dozens of large factories for production of aviation assets, whether that's aircraft or drones. And then, of course, they have their experimental factory for the development of aviation. They of course have a few large complexes to develop experimental aircraft and drones. And then, of course, you have smaller scale, like cottage industry size, I call them. You have many dozens more of those. And I call it cottage industry because we're talking about facilities that are basically like the size of, like, I don't know, like an Amazon warehouse or something like that, or like a Walmart distribution center. They're just these garage type of facilities where they build things on a smaller scale. They have many dozens of those too, in addition to these ginormous factories they have. They're just mammoth in terms of their capabilities to produce. So we, on the other hand, have shuttered all these industries. And I recall not even all that long ago, woke Lloyd Austin, the SecDef, the defense secretary. He was talking about trying to reopen newer arms production plants because we had fallen that far behind our enemies, that far. And it's just not able to be achieved, especially because of the supply chain. The lack of fuel affects everything. When you don't have the fuel, your supply chain suffers as a result. And a suffering supply chain is going to impact directly any type of arms production that you're engaging in. You have to be able to move your raw materials. You have to be able to move components from factories. And a lot of our components anymore are foreign components. We get a lot of them from China. We don't make them. We don't even get them from Taiwan, contrary to popular belief. We get them from China because it's a lowest bidder situation. And again, I'm going to mention that F-35 going haywire that I saw. It looked like it got hacked. and they have back doors into all our higher end stuff. The Chinese do. So God save us when we go to war with them. God help us, I should say. It'll be horrible because that thing straight up looked like it got hijacked. It did. I mean, it was doing all kinds of things. The pilot obviously wasn't in control of it, and he had to bail out of it while this thing was like, just gone haywire. He had to bail out of that thing. He had to use the ejector seat, and he was pretty close to the ground too. It just goes to show you that, all this stuff is like an Achilles heel when you're using electronic components and chips from an enemy nation that wants to destroy you. So we really put ourselves in a bad way by not being self-sufficient. And therein lies the dangers of globalism, because globalism created this situation that we're now in. Because our enemies smiled in our face while secretly wanting to destroy us, and they made these arrangements pretending that they were going to, quote unquote, democratize or westernize, whatever you want to call it, while, they smiled in our face with a dagger behind their back, because they were never going to do those things. They were never going to cooperate with the West. In fact, they were going to use it against the West. They only seemed to open up to the West because secretly all they wanted was concessions. They wanted concessions. They wanted to steal the crown jewels. China has the biggest, most capable espionage arm on the face of the earth, and they've gotten all the crown jewels. They got the crown jewels back in the 90s. They've infiltrated and subverted basically every corner of this country. I mean, they basically got our number. They got our number. And they've basically populated their CCP properties with different military and paramilitary units for the big day of their invasion. And that's what we're looking at. So let me see what everybody's saying here. I wonder how many people came in. Oh, hey there, Rebecca. TJ, there you are, buddy. There you are. Yes, TJ. When I looked at the chat from the last live when it rendered, you were right. It was Mahindra. It slipped my mind, but yeah, Tata Steel and Mahindra are two large Indian companies that produce vehicles. Mahindra really big with the tractors and such and construction equipment. But yeah, Tata and Mahindra, they produce vehicles in India, construction and civilian. They're two large Indian production companies, and and Tata is a big steel company too, a big steel producing company. Yeah, you were right about that with Mahindra. It has slipped my mind. I've seen Mahindra tractors advertised on TV before. They sell them in the United States, but it slipped my mind at the time. But yeah, you were right about that. Yeah, and yeah, that still remains a big problem. The thing in the arm. You're absolutely right, TJ. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, I know. I remember you said you were from Nepal. That's cool. I like that I have a lot of different people from around the world watching this. I have a fairly decent international audience. I speak some German. I used to speak German fluently, and I have listeners in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. You might have, if you watched all my material, you might have heard me speaking German in some of the videos. But yeah, I also speak a small bit of French. I have a small international audience. I mean, it's cool knowing that I have people from around the world listening to me. Little old me here with only a couple thousand subscribers. That's, it's cool. It's good to know that. It's good to know that because, the information is beneficial really to everybody, because I don't just talk about America. I talk about Europe. I talk about Asia. It's important. It's very important. And I appreciate you all being here too. Thank you. Yeah, that's still. Oh yeah, I know you live here now. I'm just saying it's cool to know I have people from all around listening to me. Yeah, but speaking of India too, they have some pretty capable military equipment that they've developed on their own. They have the Tejas, which is a fighter jet that they indigenously produced. They also have the Arjun, like I talked about in the last live stream, the Arjun main battle tank. India is developing a pretty decent arms industry. I mean, nowhere near the scale of like Russia or China, but still for indigenously produced equipment, India is starting to really get their footing. And, that's pretty impressive because when people think of India, you don't normally think of a well-developed country. I mean, for a very long time, India has been like, for the most part, very poor, but they've really recently started to develop themselves, and it's pretty impressive. They've really experienced a lot of growth in even just the last 10 years. India's grown immensely. There's still large portions of India that are really in deep poverty, but for the most part, their people are starting to really advance, and they're really starting to, do pretty well with what they've got. They're building new roads, they're improving their infrastructure, they're trying to get internet access for a lot of the rural dwellers that live out in the hinterlands, out in the countryside, like the rural subsistence farming communities and such. They're trying to get them internet access, and it's all pretty impressive what the Indians have managed to do. So India is definitely a burgeoning economy. It's growing. It's growing, and it's impressive. Their high technology sector is making headway. Like I said, it's nowhere near China. China's ginormous. They're the world superpower, the hegemon. But India is definitely a regional power, and it's one that should be respected because they're really doing a lot with what they have. And, China's the number one, obviously, but then the number two is Russia. And I would say India, for now, is tied at number three with us. And I'm saying overall, when you average everything out, I'm talking like technology, I'm talking in terms of infrastructure, because our infrastructure is aging and falling apart. We're literally disintegrating, and India's literally like moving ahead. So we're coming to like a nexus point in terms of infrastructure with them. So while we're on the descent and they're on the ascendancy. And then you have, the military aspect of things. The steel production. India dwarfs us in steel production, not by a whole lot, but they produce more steel than we do. And India has an arms manufacturing industry that's basically about the same size overall as ours is at this point, because we hardly have one anymore compared to what we used to have. So India's on the ascendancy while we're on the decline. We have a woke, hollowed out, depleted military, but India, meanwhile, actually has a really effective army. It's fairly decent sized, and they have a good air force. Their navy is, our navy is a lot better than their navy, but they still have for their size, it's a pretty decent navy. But I would say if you average everything out between the ground power, the air power, and the sea power, and I'm saying like everything combined, averaged out, India's about our rival. Like they're basically our equal in terms of, combining all aspects of military force and averaging it out. That I would say India is probably, in conventional terms, they're like our contemporary. Russia is far ahead of us, and so is China, especially. China is especially ahead of everybody. They have the world's biggest and most advanced navy. They have the world's biggest combat air fleet, and that's their combat aircraft. They have vastly more combat aircraft than any nation on Earth, because they have about 1,050 more combat planes than we have. The only reason at all why our Air Force is even a little bit bigger than China's is because we have massive amounts of cargo planes. We have this huge air mobility command. We also have a lot of AWACS, mid-air refuelers, trainer aircraft, and other such support planes. China is lacking in support aircraft, but they're starting to catch up. But they already have this massive combat air fleet that's bigger than our combat air fleet by a lot. They put a lot of emphasis into fighter jets and ground attack planes, and they have the second biggest strategic bomber fleet after Russia. But when you combine, they're just gargantuan quantity of fighters and ground attack planes to their second biggest strategic bomber fleet, they outnumber everybody. They outnumber us and Russia in combat planes. Russia's the number 2, and we're the number 3. And I'm saying when you take everything that Russia has that they maintain in storage combined with their active fleet, they're the number 2 after China. But China still has a lot more aircraft than Russia. We're the third after Russia. So China's first in combat planes. Russia's the second biggest, and then we're the third. But we're pretty close in size in terms of combat aircraft. We're pretty close in size to Russia, but they have like a few hundred more than we do. And that's everything. That's their fighters, ground attack planes, and strategic bombers all combined. That's the combat aircraft category. But we have a lot of support planes. But again, China is catching up rapidly in the number of support aircraft. They're building more cargo planes. They're building more mid-air refuelers. They're building more trainers and everything. So yeah, they have the biggest combat air fleet, so they have the biggest ability to wage a combative air campaign. They have the biggest, most advanced navy. They have by far, by a massive, massive, massive quantity, the biggest ground forces, and they also have the world's biggest missile forces. Even though most of their missiles are conventionally armed, they still have about 1,000 nukes, and their nuclear arsenal is all up to date, modern, and efficient because they have the most efficient means of delivering their nuclear payloads. They have what is that called? They have hypersonics and they have fractional orbital bombardment. That slipped my mind. That term slipped my mind for a second, but they're the only nation to have successfully tested fractional orbital bombardment systems to where they've basically tested it a few different times and they've gotten it fine-tuned to where it's actually effective and accurate. Fractional orbital bombardment is basically like taking hypersonics to the next level. Like that's when your missile circumnavigates the Earth before releasing a hypersonic glide vehicle for the terminal phase of the attack. So it goes around the world, basically, around the Earth, I mean, again, like I said, I don't believe in space, so we're talking about a flat plane that it basically goes in a circle around before detaching its glide vehicle for the terminal phase. That was a really good discussion in the last live where I discussed why space is a load of BS. I mean, not only just because all the footage is fake looking and you can tell that now that they've got CGI, they can try to make it look more convincing, but it's also because all the numbers they give simply don't even add up. Like the re-entries, the re-entry temperature and the melting points of different materials that they used on their on their capsules and such, it just doesn't even make sense, because aluminum, the exact melting point of aluminum is like 1,200 degrees. I thought it was about 1,000, but no, it's 1,200. But then they say it's like the reentry heat was 5,000 degrees. That whole thing should have melted, and they had like fiberglass and insulation for this thing. It's just like a beer can with insulation and fiberglass. What a joke. And aluminum foil. It looked like a high school kid's project or something. I mean, there's no way. There's just no way. None of it even makes sense. Then what I said about the F-15, back in the 70s, no less, in the 70s, trying to say that they shot down a satellite, which is quite impossible because it wouldn't make any sense. Look at all the thrust it takes to get a just one of the space shuttles into the air, or the rockets that they had before that. Can you imagine? Now they're trying to say that a fighter jet somehow shot down a satellite. That's impossible because you would literally need something with enough thrust. If space was real, you would need something with enough power and thrust fired from a jet, no less, that would leave the atmosphere and hit something thousands of miles above it. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. That's if space was real. But although satellites are real and they're high up near the firmament, it would still be basically next to impossible to fire an air-to-air system that high up. And we're talking about shooting something vertically into the air, not horizontally, at whatever angles. We're talking about shooting something vertically into the air off of a fighter jet. The longest air-to-air missile range is 90 miles for the Phoenix missile. So if they made like a special air-to-air system that they upgraded, sure, they might be able to take it like 30 or 40 miles further, but I don't think that there's any way, because the atmosphere that high up, it basically makes it extremely difficult for jets and rockets to function. Because if you've noticed, most of the jets that we even have, they can only fly to a certain height. They can only climb to a certain height. They can't really go much higher because of because the engines aren't running at top efficiency because of the lack of oxygen. So again, it's like how are they trying to say that they could shoot down satellites with a fighter jet? There's no way. There's just no way that a missile is going to function that effectively at that height. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't go up that high, because if jet engines don't even function at that height, and it takes this immense amount of thrust to get a rocket up that high, how are they going to fire something with that much thrust from a fighter jet? That a platform like that is so small, and you would need something so large with enough thrust to be fired from it. It's impossible. It's impossible. It wouldn't work. Again, the firmament, yeah, it could be several hundred miles, high, but still, you're not going to use an air-to-air missile system that's going to get up that high from a fighter to where it's going to knock down a satellite. That's just ludicrous. That's why the ground-based, if they could do that, if that was feasible, they wouldn't need ground-based anti-satellite weapons like the S-500 or the Chinese FK-2000. They wouldn't need those. They could just use their fighter jets to do it. But they have to use ground-based systems, which are still very advanced, but they have to use them because the missiles fired from the ground are pretty large, and they have to be to get enough thrust, to have enough boost to get up that high to hit the satellites, because you can't fire them from a fighter jet. That's just asinine. It's crazy. None of what they're saying about space makes any sense. And then there's the whole issue of it being a vacuum. Well, for it to be a vacuum, what's producing the suction? If it was a vacuum, if it was real, what's producing the suction? And if it was a vacuum, everything that's being sucked somewhere is going to eventually basically collapse. I mean, look, you run a vacuum cleaner and you're sucking all this air up, all the stuff from the carpet is making all kinds of noise because it's all smacking into each other and into the sides of the vacuum. It's just ludicrous. There's no way that any of that makes any sort of sense. None of it makes any sense. It just, where did it all, how did that all come to be? And then there's the fact of the Earth, spinning however many thousands of miles. There's a lot of issues with that too, because if you're in the air, like say you're in a helicopter or you're in an aircraft, and the Earth beneath you is spinning all these thousands of miles, shouldn't you, like say if you were in a helicopter and you hovered in place for, say you had enough fuel to do it for a few hours, shouldn't the Earth have moved on below you? Shouldn't, you know what I'm saying? It just doesn't make any sense. None of that makes any sense whatsoever at all. It defies the laws of physics. It defies a whole lot of things. It defies logic and reasoning. It just doesn't make no sense. None of it does. It's madness. It's total madness. It's total fabrication. It's total lies is what it is. Space is a lie. Yes, there's other dimensions, but there is no space. And by dimensions, I'm wording it as a dimension because, what the book of Enoch describes, the only thing you can call it is dimensions, because heaven's a dimension, hell's a dimension, earth is a dimension, and the different worlds that exist outside of the earth that were described in Enoch, those two would be dimensions. Everything that's outside of the firmament, I call them dimensions because it's the only word that I can call them that makes any sort of sense. So that's just my take on it. Yeah. There isn't. There can't be. There cannot be. You're right, Kathy. There just can't be. It just doesn't make any rational sense. It defies all kinds of things. It defies logic and reasoning. It just defies everything. There can be no such thing as space. Not any sort of way it's described, not in how it's taught, not in all the quote unquote, fake evidence they've given, like all these fake vehicles they've made for alleged space travel. None of it makes any sense. And if you had something functioning in a vacuum, it would be destroyed too, because all the suction, it would just rip something apart like a rocket or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't understand how people can believe any of that garbage. It just all defies logic. Let me see what everybody's saying here before I go on with my video here. How's everybody doing? It'll let me see. It's not letting me see anyways. So now that I'm off of that one, as it has to do with the future, though, what I was saying about the proxy conflict coming to an end before I got off on space, it's going to have to come to an end pretty soon, unless they just want to drag it out till summertime, which I just don't see them doing it. I think the most responsible thing to do, even from the Russian standpoint, would be to bring this thing to an end as quickly as possible. They've drug this thing out about as far as they can drag it out with any sort of mishaps, and they've done a pretty damn good job of keeping, maintaining world peace so far by not letting anything get out of hand and develop into a wider war. I would say that they've been pretty responsible as far as that goes, but that's not to say that they're good by any stretch of the imagination. I am not saying that, the regime in Moscow is a good regime, but what I am saying is that I'm sure, according to their own plans, or the plans they've made with China and with BRICS Plus, they don't necessarily want things to get out of hand right now, because they want things to get out of hand at a time and place of their choosing. You have to remember, they're very long-term thinkers. They're chess players. They have set up their pieces. They have based their forces inside of our land, and they want to strike at a time and place of their choosing, so they're not going to let anybody else dictate those terms to them. Now, I've seen some crazy things this past week, like people saying that, allegedly, the American Armed Forces was preparing some sort of decapitation strike. Well, you see, there's a lot of problems with that. For one thing, Russia is not a third world country. It's the second most powerful nation on the face of the earth. They're more powerful than we are. If they even tried something like that, our cities would be next. Russia would park vessels off our coasts, or they would just fire, long-range missiles at us. They would do something to retaliate. They would fly their, heavy strategic aircraft over the Arctic Circle, and they would, cut loose. They would let loose some payloads. They would do something to retaliate. That there's no, there's with their submarines or whatever else too. They have options. If something like that was ever attempted too, they have to know that Russia has the second biggest air defense arm in the entire world after China. And they have extremely capable air defense systems, like the upgraded S-300s, the S-400s, and of course the anti-ballistic missile, anti-satellite, and anti-stealth bomber S-500 systems. So they have to know that. So any type of such of an airstrike, it would be ill-fated, and it would besides just their air defenses, they also have this massive air force, which is the second biggest overall air force after China's. So something like that would be ill-fated from the start, and it would cause a massive retaliation in response. It wouldn't. What if one of their subs was just parked off the coast somewhere and just started firing Caliber cruise missiles at certain entities or just cities in general? What would that be like? They have to know that. So anytime I see stuff like that being reported, I just sort of roll my eyes at it because it's really stupid. It's like people are just I don't understand how some of these crazy narratives proliferate through the news. It just doesn't make any sense. People think that we're so big and bad, and we're really not. We're really not. We're nothing like we once were. We're like a regional power, and we have this gutted, hollowed out, depleted, weak, woke military that's increasingly depleted as we send the vast majority of our ammunition abroad. It's ludicrous. It's just ludicrous. So we're putting ourselves in this really horrible spot, and people just don't even they just don't even see it. They don't even realize it. But that's why I cover these things, because it's important that people understand where we really are, as far as where we are in time and where we are in our capabilities. We really don't have the capabilities to wage any type of large scale conflict like we once did. And even when we did, those capabilities were very, very limited. If we were to get in some kind of high intensity conflict, we really lack the ammunition for anything beyond a matter of weeks. And when I say high intensity, I mean you're firing on all cylinders, everything you've got. You're using your artillery shells left and right. You just steady using up your ammunition, your equipment, everything. We just don't have it. We just don't have it. So if we got into a high intensity warfare with Eastern nations who have these ginormous quantities of ammunition and arms, we would never prevail. And now that we've pissed away these immense amounts of not just ammunition but gear and sent it into this proxy conflict to either be destroyed or maybe even diverted to the black markets, and sent to other nations, we're really, really, really in severe trouble. We just don't have the industries remaining to replenish these items. It would literally take decades to replenish a lot of the ammunition that we have pissed away, as well as some of the systems, to be fair, like the portable anti-tank systems, the man-portable air defense systems. It would take an immense amount of time to replace those losses. And then a lot of the production lines, too, like I've mentioned many times, and, with that strategic studies chart I had, a lot of the production lines aren't even active anymore because they don't exist. Or if they are, they're only semi-active. Very few are fully active, which is a big, big issue if you're a war planner. They have to know. They have to know. They have to know fully and understand fully the true condition that we're really in. And then we have this woke, depleted military, and now they're letting in all kinds of people with mental health defects, severe ones too. I don't normally watch some of these alternative news stations, but the one story is actually true that I saw. I think it was like Next News 3 or something like that. I don't normally watch them, but this one got my attention, where they're letting all these people with like mental health defects get, that they no longer need waivers. They can just go ahead and get in. So now we have wokesters, we have, Looney Tunes, and, we got all kinds of stuff running amok in there. It's not going to end well. There's going to be people with anxiety disorders and panic disorders, and you're asking them to, keep a cool head in a conflict. Get real, man. Get real. Give me a break. You know why? You know why that's happening? It's happening because we can't meet our recruiting goals. We just can't meet them. And the reason we can't meet them is basically because of the man to the dates, and also because of that certain thing that they're trying to make everybody take. And as far as other reasons are concerned, it's also because of the woke stuff. People don't want to join a force like that. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's just not. It's nowhere near as professional or as good of a force as it was back when I was in. 10 years ago. Well, now I should say 11 years ago. It was vastly more professional than it is now. So now it's just over the course of the last 10 or so years, almost 11 years, it's really deteriorated to shocking levels of just decay and collapse. I mean, I don't understand how they think they're going to be able to take on a nation like Russia, much less the world superpower China, or even smaller countries. How are we going to fare? Say if we even gotten like a scuffle. This is hypothetical. Say if we got in a scuffle with Iran or with like a country like North Korea, probably wouldn't even fare all that well against them either, because of the composition of our force and because of the depleted stocks of ammo we have. It would just be a disaster. It's going to be a very turbulent, rough, horrible 2023 year, and you're going to continue to see things go down the drain, and it's going to start to become apparent even to the normalcy bias people that something is severely wrong, especially when there's a total supply chain collapse, a total complete food and fuel collapse, which technically, if you want to get technical, we have been in one since past August, but because of all the window dressing that's been going on, yes, and by that I mean in the stores where they've been spacing out shelves and removing whole shelves and spacing them out further, where they've been fronting items to make it look like there's more than what there really is, or when they've gotten these painted sections of they could like flap over where there's shelving with nothing in it, to make it look like there's abundance. Yeah, there's been a lot of window dressing going on all over the place with these supply chain bottlenecks that are going to eventually turn into full supply chain collapse. Wait till the rail systems and trucks stop running because there's no diesel, which you're steadily hearing about how the diesel's running out rapidly. We've really been in a very harsh predicament with diesel since August, and it's only going to get worse. So when these things really fully manifest and the supply chain completely collapses, the whole country is going to collapse with it. The economy is going to collapse with it, finances, the currency value, everything is going to collapse. And it doesn't even matter if they have some kind of digital something waiting in the wings to replace the fiat paper. It's going to be every bit as worthless. And if there's grid issues, you're not even going to be able to use it no kind of way. It'll be a total flop and a failure. It's not going to work. Even in my internal conflict documentary, I highlighted the fact and all the problems with it as to why it was a flop and it didn't work and it was inefficient and it was worthless and nobody used it because parallel economies and black markets cropped up everywhere where there were other methods of exchange and currency and barter and such. That is exactly the type of thing that would occur in a total collapse, whereby you have the fiat paper basically becoming, completely worthless. So like extremely hyperinflated to where it's just not even worth using. And then they try to replace it with something digital. It's just not going to work. It's not going to be a replacement. No, rather instead, you're going to be seeing alternate systems crop up everywhere. And not only that, but in the East, the true one world currency is already being developed. It'll be a BRICS currency that are being developed by these BRICS nations. That'll be the one world currency it'll be a digital currency that'll replace every other system once World War III has concluded and the West has been soundly defeated by the nations of the East. by China, by Russia, and by all their smaller allies. They'll already have that BRICS plus currency waiting in the wings to be the new one world currency. You'll see it. That's exactly how it'll happen. There's not going to be a West. There's not going to be a Western anything. It's all going to fall apart. It's going to be taken over. These Western elites aren't going to be running anything except for maybe a sewing machine and a Chicom Lao guy or a Russian gulag mining rocks or something. That's all they're going to be doing because those are the rivals of the Eastern elites. And they're going to be pulled out of their hidey holes, very much tantamount to what happened to Saddam in Iraq. They're going to do the same thing with the DUMBs. You're going to see it. It's going to happen. Because remember, these uber rich, these elites from around the world, they could care less about each other. They don't care about each other. They're evil. They only care about themselves and their own power and stabbing each other in the back. And that's what they're going to do to each other. In this case, the Eastern elites are going to come out triumphant. So, let me see what's being said here before I get going. Yeah, Rage Against the Machine. I'm sure this will be another this thing that they're trying to concoct. It'll be just another death knell to the whole economy. It'll be just something that'll, get the normalcy bias people all, frazzled up again and get them all scared and make things just fall apart that much quicker. Yeah. There's going to be all kinds of disasters that are going to occur in the next year, and I see that definitely being part of it. It's not going to be like any one singular issue, but it'll be like death by 1,000 cuts, proverbially speaking. They're going to do all kinds of things to bring the West to its knees, whether that's these Western elites destroying their own power block with things like that, with a new thing, that they can unroll new things in the arm for, allegedly. Things like that are going to be like the final death knell into this whole system in the West. It's going to bring the whole thing collapsing down. And then, of course, you're going to have other things. There's going to be probably like a billion different, like, small scale type of FF events, and whether that's done by these Western elites or whether it's done by the foreign Chicom, intelligence and Russian intelligence people that are in this country that are sabotaging things. It would either be Eastern or Western sabotage, depending. But yeah, things are going to take an ugly turn next year for sure. It's not going to be a good year at all. Nothing good about anything is going to occur next year. So just, keep preparing, keep getting yourselves ready, and, learn as much as you can. That's why I made a community tab story review for the stories I wrote, so that it focuses on all the important things that one would want to pay attention to if they were trying to survive any type of like armed struggle where you have different combatants all going at it, or whether it's an invasion or whatever. It applies across the board, whether it's something internal or whether it's something foreign, like a foreign invasion. Those lessons are priceless. And, the reviews are very important to pay attention to. And I really hope everybody, not only has read the stories in my community tab, but also watch that review and also watch the documentaries to see what those things look like on the maps, like the overall macro scale, which means like the maps themselves, where you're like looking down on the different units moving and what they're doing. Of course, there's the internal conflict stuff, which kind of shows what a Syrian-style situation would move like. It shows all the concepts. Sure, when it happens in real life, yeah, the factions might have different names, but all the concepts are there. And, for a hypothetical, it's pretty damn accurate. It's pretty damn true to life, I have to say. It's pretty true to life. It's got woke militias because the regime didn't have enough manpower, so they had to recruit woke militias. Well, guess what? Woke militias are a real thing. They made an appearance already with standardized uniforms and everything and equipment to protect a certain type of event already in a place in Texas, I'll just say. Woke militias are real. And I made that documentary before They even made themselves known. So I also have the Free American Army, which is a play off of the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian conflict, civil conflict. I had the Free American Army, which they came into being. They manifested based on the all the different tyranny that has been going on within the armed forces, trying to get rid of like what is it, 500,000, like basically a quarter of our entire military for not complying, and then all the woke stuff. I mentioned all of that. That's all in there. So, and that was before the 260,000 number came out, which then increased now to 500,000, which I've been mentioning recently. But before that, if you look at my older videos, I mentioned that it's 260,000 because it originally was, and I said that that might be your beginnings of like the Free American Army right there. Then of course I represented the secular humanists in the form of like the ultra nationalist secular humanists in the form of the NSRF. I represented the kooks and the cults with the Mormon state. I represented everybody, really. I mean, I represented like Southern secessionists in the Southeast. I represented whole states that left, like Florida and Texas were whole states that left to try to become independent countries. I even represented, of course, I had the regime. I had more libertarian type of groups like the Union of Southwest Militias and the Maine Militia, and then I had like your classic conservatives that were the Northwest Conservative Army. I mean, I had everybody in that thing. That whole thing was so detailed. I mean, even from the foreign involvement by the third video that shows what type of weapons got introduced into the conflict from Russia and China, like just cheap, easy to produce, like weapons that they have ginormous stocks of that they just sent just to involve themselves in it to help destabilize things even further. I mean, I put all kinds of details into that. That thing was so well made. I mean, it highlights so many concepts all in one series. I mean, it's roughly about 12 hours long if you watch it like the whole way through. The first video and a half is just like a story reading, like the origin story of how everything began, and then it goes into like the battle maps, and then I talk about the atrocities, the leaders, the WMDs used, like the chemical weapons, and even the one single nuke that got used. I mean, I went into massive detail with it. And I really included everything: the economies, the resources. I mean, I talked about all of it, the different types of means of economic exchange that cropped up, the trade. Even Texas and Florida, who were allies, conducted trade at sea because in real life there's the reserve naval fleet in Beaumont, Texas, which has cargo ships and oil tankers. And the Texans, when they became, their own faction, their own independent faction, they took those ships and used it to conduct trade with Florida to help try to keep them afloat in the conflict by sending them oil. And in return, Florida sent them back food that could be produced and quickly brought to the port, or certain Air Force arms that they had, because there's a lot of aerial assets already in Florida, so they would send them back munitions for the planes and such. I mean, just different things like that, just your standard trade that would be occurring in a conflict. So it was a well put together, very detailed presentation, and all the battle maps that show the tactical and strategic movements on the maps. I put a lot of detail into those too, which were just the major battles, which were the high intensity aspects of the war. I talked about the lower intensity aspects, but I didn't show them on maps because that was going on everywhere. You had low intensity warfare all over the land, but the high intensity stuff was when there were actual large concentrations of troops all in one spot with their logistics and everything you need to carry out a large, battle or campaign. But there were only like a handful of really large battles. But they, from the second video to the last video, I included those. I even had a special operations mission shown in the last video. It was pretty cool. I mean, I put all kinds of detail into that. It was a really good presentation. Like I said before, I don't even mind listening to it over and over. It's one of my favorite things I think I ever made. I love my invasion stuff, don't get me wrong, but that civil conflict stuff just includes everything. It has like everything in one type of presentation, like everything, the maps, the storytelling, the economics, finance, all of it. It's all in one thing, which is why I like it so much. But the invasion stuff is excellent. I'm actually going to shortly be doing some more story readings for my audiobook because I'm trying to wrap that up. And then by the time I finish that, I'll be done off of YouTube. But, I might do like one long finale, farewell video, and then I'll be off the tubes. The only thing I'll be doing after that is just community tab stuff to support, other channels that I'm cool with or whatever else. Yeah. Let's see what everybody's saying. I can see the chat again. Good. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, TJ. Just a bunch of Call of Duty wannabe wokesters that they don't have no skills. They're getting annihilated in a war. And also, yeah, you're right. The obese people, just this whole country's gone down the tubes. There's no discipline. There's no work ethic. There's no anything anymore. There's just all this. Just the whole society is rotting from within. It's just rotten. But, yep. Well, y'all, thank you for coming. Thank you, Kathy and Rebecca and Rage Against the Machine and TJ and Lady M and let's see who else. And well, that's all I see in the chat. Well, thank you, everybody. If I missed anybody, thank you too for coming. But I appreciate each and every one of you. Y'all have a blessed night.